I'm gonna regroup all of us. The pillar is very interesting. I don't really know what to do with it, but I'll do my best. So anyway, it's not a trick question. I've heard a lot of interesting conversations, and I'm not going to give you an answer because there really isn't an answer. But what I'd like you to do is sort of keep in mind the thoughts and discussions you're having, and the reasons or rationale that you've been thinking about why some of these might better describe active learning or not, and carry these thoughts throughout the seminar today, and we'll come back to some of these thoughts as we go on. Right, so I'm going to actually start with a study or an experiment on active learning in physics done by people in Carl Wyman's group at the time at University of British Columbia. So in this case, right, there's an experimental group and a comparison group where both of them have lectures for the first 12 weeks of the course, and then in the last week, one section of the course did various types of active learning activities for the material discussed in the course and then the last week, and then there was a test just on this material at the end. And so what they found was that students in the active learning section scored a lot better on this particular test that focused on the material that was learned in the last week. And the standard measurement to sort of describe or compare different outcomes is something called effect size, which is the mean, of one group versus another divided by the standard deviation. So it's really talking about sort of normalizing to how many standard deviations the difference is. So in this case, the difference is about 2.5 standard deviations between the active learning group, who scored much better on the test than the traditional lecture group. Right, and so this is not really the only study that on these types of approaches. There's a meta-analysis a couple of years ago by Scott Freeman and colleagues at University of Washington. Right, and so what they found out of about 160 studies across STEM disciplines is that there's about 0.5 effect size for students who are in active learning sections or active learning courses compared to the more classic instructional method in the different studies. Those are defined slightly differently by studies. But essentially what we found is that there's an overall effectiveness that are across many studies. Right? So that's not really the first meta-analysis. It's probably not going to be the last one. There's a number of them sort of on general ideas related to active learning in higher education. There are discipline-specific ones. Here's one in chemistry and in engineering. And then there are other ones that are sort of specific to different kinds of active learning strategies. So there's a number of them in problem-based learning, which is often used in various medical schools.
What do the tails represent?
The tail represents 95% confidence interval in this case. So the geology one is just 2 studies. All right, so because of these studies over the decades, right, this has led to a lot of national calls for changes in undergraduate education. It actually started about 25 years ago. Is that right? Did I do the math correctly? Yes. Right. So Science for All Americans is quite some time ago, and leading up to a couple of years ago from the report to the president from the President Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. There's a couple more large reports and publications since then, but I ran out of slide space to put them in. But essentially, right, really based on all this evidence calling for reform or change in undergraduate education to be more interactive, to be more research-based, to engage students in deep learning and understanding material that's relevant to them and the society at large, right? So this has been all good, but at the same time, right, what's really interesting is that there's a small and persistent literature that says active learning, very broadly defined, right, does not always correlate with student outcomes, right? So in this case, it's a study in biology where the authors went out into the wild, right, and asked about 30 to 33 instructors, and asked the instructors, well, how many active learning things do you do per week, right? And then they also gave students a test on evolution at the beginning and at the end of the course. And essentially what they found is that there is no correlation, right, between student learning and the number of active learning things that these different instructors did in their courses. Right? So for example, there's this course that did fairly little active learning things, but students had a lot of learning gain in this case. And then there are courses out here where there's a lot of active learning activities, but the learning gain isn't that high. And so again, this is not an isolated incident, right? So there's actually a lot of literature in K-12 education that's related to this phenomenon where when a particular curriculum or a teaching strategy or an intervention of any kind, when they are scaled to large, when they're disseminated and scaled up to large populations, the efficacy diminishes as the scale up happens. Right, and so we think about active learning in higher education as generically one kind of intervention, right? So perhaps as it scales up, right, there's also this interesting phenomenon where the efficacy becomes less or becomes more inconsistent. Right, and so what I really like to think about is I talk mostly to biologists because one of my appointments in biological sciences. And so I'm really thinking about this type of phenomenon is that, right, I like to make the analogy to smoking and cancer, right? So there's been a lot of evidence that smoking causes cancer, right? We know that now, and there's there's never been really a large scale, multinational, longitudinal, randomized controlled trial, right, that demonstrated smoking causes cancer. It's a lot of sort of retrospective population studies, a lot of basic molecular biology and cell biology studies that supported the mechanism for how smoking caused cancer. Right? So the analogy is, right, active learning leads to better student outcomes, and we have a lot of evidence for that. Right? But at the same time, we have people who smoke a pack a day. Is that a lot of cigarettes? I don't really know. I'm like after the generation of people who smoke, so I don't know. I don't have a good sense of it. But anyway, right, there are these people who smoke a pack a day and live to like 100 years old and never have developed lung cancer or anything like that, right? And right, we don't use those people as evidence that smoking doesn't cause cancer, or evidence that smoking doesn't cause cancer. But what's really interesting is something unique or something special biologically is happening with these people, right? And sort of the equivalent is what is happening here, right? That by and large, active learning has efficacy across many settings, right? But in some cases, it doesn't quite work. And so my interest is really thinking about these sort of fundamental problems for what's going on. Right, so in education study, I sort of like to bin them in two flavors. There are the intervention-based research, so these sort of look at specific strategies, specific programs, and look at their efficacies. Right, so again, in the sort of biomedical analogies, this is sort of the clinical trials that physicians would do, right? It's sort of specific, therapeutic for a specific disease or therapy, right? And then those therapies or interventions, right, should be supported by basic research, so very much like a lot of the research that's done in my department in biological sciences, right, thinking about how cell cycle happens and how that relates to cancer. And in this case, right, in education is really how people learn fundamentally and how do that inform, right, what we do in terms of the interventions. Right, and then on the other side, right, sometimes when we do an intervention, right, like the case where the biology education paper that saw no efficacy, right, in active learning, so whatever that intervention is, right, sometimes there's really interesting observations, right, that allows us to get at fundamental questions, right, so that's sort of the cycle that I'm looking at in my research, and it's mostly focused on the basic research, but a lot of it is informed by specific observations in different implementations of active learning in classroom. Right, so today I'm actually going to talk to you about two specific case studies. So case studies are these really in-depth examination of distinct, sort of unique instances of a very specific observation or phenomenon that we're looking at. They're really good for probing problematic scenarios. So in this case, the problematic scenario is that, right, we know active learning has efficacy in most cases but then there's a small and persistent subpopulation of this intervention that doesn't quite work. Right, so in this case, what we're looking at is two instructors, and we're going to connect how they teach to what their student outcomes are. And then case studies are also really useful to look at maximum variation across the spectrum of variety. And so the idea here for the second case study is we have 3 instructors that are at different point of a continuum that allows us to study in depth what's happening in their classrooms. In this case, they're actually teaching different courses, so we don't really have student outcomes to compare. Right, so the first case, right, so these 2 wonderful colleagues, they developed a course together, new course. They developed it collaboratively and included a lot of different kinds of active learning activities. So this is a large lecture with 200, 300 students where they have clicker questions. They also sometimes have these large group activities where the entire class session of 15 minutes students are working on problems together, right? And so the 2 courses are pretty much identical from the instructor's perspective. All the material were the same. In fact, the syllabus was the same, and they just swapped their names out, right? And then they taught in the same room, right? And Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 10 o'clock versus 11 o'clock, right? So sort of by chance as similar or identical as possible. Right? We're going to call them Adam and Philip. These are pseudonyms. They're both male and Caucasian, and that may come into play in a minute. So what we did was we administered a concept test at the beginning and at the end of the course to see how much students were learning. And so what we found is that when students take courses, they learn things. This is a good thing, right? But what's interesting is that students in Philip's section, right, learned more than students who were in Adam's section of the same course. Right? So there's about a 0.2 standard deviation difference in the effect size. Okay. What's also interesting is we gave them pre and post surveys for their motivation and interests in continuing in the discipline. What we found is that students in Adam's section had decreased interest in science career, has decreased science self-efficacy, and have sort of decreased interest in science in general. Whereas in Philip's section, there's basically no change from the beginning to the end of the course. This is pretty interesting and important to note is that in general, we know from the literature that when students take introductory STEM courses in college, their interest and motivation decrease. So the fact that there's no change is actually quite a significant achievement in this case. Right? It's sad, but it's an achievement. Right? So, and then finally what we looked at is how many students or the percentage of students completed these courses. There's a significant difference between students in Adam's versus Philip's section. So about 85% of Adam's students completed the course and about 95% of Philip's students did. There's actually a difference for underrepresented minority students versus majority students, but only in Adam's section. And in this case, there's no difference for gender. But what's also interesting is this was the first biology course in a series of 4 introductory biology courses. And so what we found is that at the end of 4 quarters, right, again, fewer students who started in Adam's section completed all 4 courses. And now there's a difference not only between underrepresented minority students and majority students, but there's also a gender difference. But again, only for students who started in Adam's section, but not for students who started in Philip's section. Right? And so here's sort of the summary, right? So there's a learning difference, right? There is an affective motivation and interest difference. There's a persistence or retention, sort of continuation in the major. There's a difference in that, right? And then there's a demographics difference or gap, but only in Adam's section, right? And so what I'd like to ask you to do is really think about, right, brainstorm how the 2 sections were different. And what I'd like to ask you to do is talk to people around you, but really focus on the concrete, tangible actions or behaviors that these 2 instructors might be doing. Not the sort of immutable features of the instructors. So I've heard people say things like, oh, well, maybe one of them is, older, so they're less relatable, right, to the students. And then I have other people say, well, maybe one of them's older and is more grandfatherly, so they're more relatable to students, right? And then I have people say, oh, maybe one of them's more good-looking, right? So people pay more attention, and then other people say, well, maybe one of them's good-looking and it's distracting, right? So not the sort of immutable, unchangeable features of the instructors, but really think about the kinds of things that they're doing in the classroom that might have made the difference. So let's brainstorm for a few minutes and we'll take a look together.
So do we think their materials are
What is it? Matthew? 80. Nice to meet you.
I think somebody's got it.
I don't try to remember.
It does sound.
I would imagine that.
I think they think about inclusion. What's that? You know that based on data, they struggle with the notion of inclusion.
No, but it's the same as lectures.
Something or a technique. I don't think you want to go singling out students, but I think the cognitive notion there.
Framing. What do you mean by framing?
in terms of language?
There's so many different ways you can relate to class.
Rewarding effort.
I think it comes down to what you're saying. No, I had to look back at it. Yeah.
So maybe like the major difference is going to be
There is a factor of being inclusive as well.
they have.
Or the levels to which students are talking to
Working backwards, like he said, like that maybe like
one class
I mean, even think about usage of language.
you're doing it actively, but not being included. In the sense that you're making sure the students have that.
Language biology connection takes us into a bio course, right? But taking that extra step to provide that process.
What else would it be?
Were these people
Into discussion. None of these four bullet points. And the other one is
One of them has 20 years more experience and the other one is brand new.
I'm wondering if one of them may have then dominated the creation of the
which actually now say that experience doesn't exactly apply. The young person is creating all these new materials. But it's the same. Basically, we're wondering.
I think it said that it was like 10 to 11.
Yeah, I know. No, see, that's interesting.
I love the notion of
I know
not
that
allowing
classes where people different, like having learning style classes, and everyone's like,
if you're in a class where
so
maybe hard to gauge by academic section something else than having a diversity in group.
I'm saying that content, but it's the same content as well.
Yes. And we actually asked them
and I've also responded to the same thing in motivations, right? Like, all their yeah, I think it's some like very well done.
Same scenario.
same day. In fact, they sat in on each other's classes.
Right?
When I make the notes later, how they sync up.
Okay, all right. So should we? Let's take a look together. Right. So So what are some of your ideas? Let's hear a few of them. Could two groups maybe tell us what you've been talking about? This is just like in a classroom. Nobody wants to volunteer.
I'll be that student.
Are you in the same group?
No, go.
No,
Okay.
All right, I guess.
All right, well, what-
So we talked a little bit about framing. So if instructors are doing the same activities, but based how those activities may be presented, it might change how students are going to respond, whether they'll buy in and want to do it and then therefore learn, or whether they're just participating for the sake of participating.
Right, so maybe there's some kind of different introduction or language used between the instructors that made a difference. That's possible. What other ideas were you discussing? Yeah.
Relationship, or the way that the instructor interacts with the students, and that could be even before class.
Right, so
Yeah.
how they interact with students.
Dynamic.
Right, the dynamic, which may be driven by language, but may not be necessarily driven by the sort of spoken language, right? Yeah.
I was gonna say the same thing. Essentially, like the instructor was inclusive or not. Like how the student related to the instructor, and what was I don't know what the population of this student was, but so that might be critical.
So very similar ideas, right? So what we actually did was we observed them, and we video recorded their classes. And so what we did was we used this particular protocol called COCUS, which is a protocol where every 2-minute interval we had a checklist of what the instructors are doing and what the students are doing. So for example, the instructor could be lecturing, posing, answering questions, having extended discussions and moving in groups, so there's some sort of interaction element to this, right? And then the student actions has a list of listening, asking and answering questions, thinking individually or working in groups in various forms, right? There's actually about 25 different things total between the instructor and the student actions, right? And so what we found is that this is implementation of group activities between Adam and Philip. So for 60%, about 60% of the 2-minute interval, Adam spent some or all of portions of those waiting. So he spent a lot of time at the podium. Whereas Philip spent most of the time walking, moving around in groups and having extended discussions with the groups. Right? Philip also provided a lot more follow-up information, so he would stop the entire class during group activities and provide additional information or clarifications, like, I talked to a few groups and it sounds like this particular part wasn't clear, so let me clarify or give you additional information. Or, if you're thinking about in this direction, right, you may want to stop and think the other way, right? Various sorts of follow-up information that's based on feedback that he's gotten walking around and talking to different groups of students, right? And then for clicker questions in lectures, right, what we found is that Philip spent a lot more time answering questions and again having this kind of extended discussion, sort of one-to-one or one-to-many in the classroom where you're sort of going back and forth between multiple students and your questions and answers. Whereas Adam didn't do that as much, and then whereas the other things would be somewhat. Okay. So this is a really interesting difference, right, for two people who thought they taught the same course, where everything was the same, right? But it turns out the way they implemented it is very different, right? And so what we really wanted to know is why they were different, right? And thinking about why they chose to make these decisions, either explicitly or implicitly, right? So whether they knew they were making these decisions or not, we wanted to know why, right? They chose to implement things the way they did. So we did a bunch of interviews that really looked at what their beliefs or conceptions are about teaching. And we coded those interviews as part of a larger data set that we've been working on, right? And so what we're really interested in is in the literature what's called conceptions of teaching. This is really about their attitudes and beliefs or disposition about teaching in this case. It's sort of the why, like what people see as the goal or the purpose of their teaching. And then, in the literature, the idea is that what you believe in informs what your intentions and strategies are, sort of the how. So in this case would be making an explicit decision about using clickers or doing group activities, right? And then the practice is what you actually do in the classroom. So in the literature, there's this idea that maybe there's a linear connection, right? What you believe in informs what you plan to do, and what you plan to do informs what you actually do, right? Seems pretty reasonable connection, right? And so what we wanted to do is go back to the beginning and really understand the conception, right? And so what I have here is a bunch of interview excerpts. They're not necessarily from Adam or you and I don't know. They're not necessarily from Adam and Philip, but they represent sort of different conceptions of teaching that university faculty may hold. And so what I'd like you to do is to take a look at them and arrange them into different conceptions of teaching based on whatever criteria you want to use or whatever criteria you can come up with by looking at them.
I provide that. Seems like like in the material, like the plate is hard.
Yeah, that feels sort of.
Any categories.
So I don't know, what should you say, like?
So it's really about
Try to categorize them in any categories we want.
Yeah, I think we're just going to sort these into just like.
It's very student-centric.
So you're not teaching
Creating an atmosphere.
Okay.
Student-centric. So let's call it student-centric.
And they have to be able to
You
try
can't really
to
teach people if you just leave it at that. It's really depressing. But
Remember the core principles.
yeah, there's a lot of dots. Yeah, still, he was still in the forest, wasn't he? All right, so concepts of teaching based on any categorization.
So anything you notice that you can come up with.
that's sort of right? But they also say you're
Empowering them.
It's not educational.
What about the other one?
Well, basic information. Learn the material. There are many complaints because they say the exams are much more itself. But
I'm just trying to think in terms of students.
this feels research-centered. It gives someone's understanding of the world, but makes it deeper in mindless scholarship of what is rigorously according to our problem.
Is they were talking about it.
The onus is on the students to teaching themselves.
Oh, I see. No, sorry. I thought you said recording that by a student.
You can really teach facilitate that, but they have to do it. So I see my place as more of a facilitator now. I would want them to still remember the core principles.
Enabling them to do that.
So this one goes to this notion of facilitator, power.
No, we were.
It's not important for you to understand how these facts were arrived at or those systems were developed. In that case, I think it's important for people to be sensitive to the process.
Deeper learning.
So you know the in some sense.
Almost like a scientific
Maybe more of this.
Yeah, it's kind of a hybrid, but a little deeper here. So this would be more of that facilitator, this would be more of that.
There is something about this aspect of like discovery. It's hard to like put in one category.
But it's also we have teachers like this, right? So like
Yeah, well, so actually this sort of chopped it out, but then after this person said the word true, he spent the next 5 minutes telling us how it's only true until
Our discipline's math, so
Okay, well, fair enough. But yeah.
Like, I have to give them all the information, but then they have to get.
But you know, it does feel like like you said,
Facilitating and empowering.
Okay, let's regroup and take a look together. So we should consider this like a cooking show where you put the chicken in the oven and then after the commercial break, like a different chicken comes out. Because this took people about 20 years to figure out, and we're not going to be here for 20 years. So what are some commonalities that you noticed that, out of these 6 interview excerpts? I think we may have a volunteer in the back.
Sure. Some of them were about like guiding or focused on the method, whereas some other category that we had was about maybe relaying facts.
Okay, so some of them are related to guiding or the sort of skills or methods in the discipline, and then others are about sort of the facts and knowledge in the discipline, right? Okay. Did any other group notice anything else? Or, yeah.
We had some trends. I'll say only one of them.
Sure.
Maybe Alex can pick it up. We saw that some are more student-centered and some are more teacher-centered.
Okay. So some are more perhaps focused on the teaching and the instructor, and others are more focused on the learning and the students. Okay. All right. It's a little bit hard to see with the. But anyway, yeah. So that pretty much sums up, about 20 odd some odd years of research. Right? Good work. You're sort of dipping your toes in qualitative research. So this was actually really extensive work done in the 80s and 90s across the world. A lot of it was done in Europe and Australia and Asia, but also some of them was done in North and South America. And so it turns out that after interviewing tens of thousands of faculty across the world in higher education, there's roughly 3 major conceptions of teaching. One of them is transmission. And the idea here is to get the content out. You're like a radio, and so whatever you do in the teaching is separate from whatever the students do, right? Your job is like a one-way monologue where you get the information out. One of my favorite instance or story from the literature is that this researcher, contacted an instructor or faculty and say, can I come interview you about teaching and all these things? And the instructor said, sure, come to, I'm giving lecture at this time, why don't you come at the end, have a look and we'll go for tea afterwards and do the interview, right? So the researcher went to class, and when the researcher got to class, right, the instructor is doing their lecture, right? There was 0 students in the room, right? The instructor was the only living human being in the room, and they were doing their lecture, right? And this is before, recording or podcast or anything. So it's literally this person's just doing the thing with one, themselves in the room, right? So the researcher was like, this is very curious. But the researcher said, okay, I'll wait until we're done and we'll talk about it, in the interview. So in the interview, the instructor revealed that, the way he understands teaching is that, it's his job to give the lecture. Right, and so he is a professional person, and he has that professional responsibility to give the lecture even though no students show up. And so he's still going to do it, right, when no students show up. Right, so that's a sort of extreme manifestation of the transmission conception, right? Now, not everyone who has a transmission conception would lecture to an empty lecture room, but that's sort of an extreme case. And so this is an interview excerpt that's consistent with the transmission conception. I don't think this is one of yours, but here it says, right, it's not important for students to understand how these facts were derived, right, and how the systems were developed. In this case, it's important for people to be presented with these ideas. The second one is acquisition. So in this case, what the instructor's goal or intention of teaching is to help students acquire knowledge and skills that's already been developed in the field or discipline. Right, so in this case, right, teaching pretty much directly causes learning, right? If I teach better, then more learning should happen, right? And it's sort of a one-way transaction, right? So I have all the goods, and somehow I have to help you get it, right? And so a quote here is, you can't really teach people, you can facilitate that. And I see myself as a facilitator, right? By and large, up to this point, it's unclear what this is, but the goal for this facilitation is for students to still remember the core principles from the course, right? So in this case, it's helping students acquire that knowledge that's been developed. The third one is development, which I didn't quite know how to draw, but the idea here is that teaching is really a facilitation of development or construction of knowledge, or changing students' ideas or mindsets about the world. And so in this case, teaching is really a byproduct of learning. So if learning happened, then teaching has happened regardless of what's going on, right? And so teaching is sort of a two-way conceptual exchange, where in this case, the faculty or the instructor doesn't hold all the knowledge, right? There's a give and take process going on. My favorite literature example is I hope I get the history right, but I think in the 80s, there was a social movement in the UK where a lot of older women went back to university to get higher education. So there's a lot of programs developed specifically for this demographic. And this one particular faculty person was teaching a capstone course in these programs, and he had a student come up to him. This is very late in the program, and students are set to graduate in a month or two. Right? This student said, Professor, I've decided to it's not you, right? I've decided to leave the course and to leave the program altogether. Right? And the faculty thought, well, this is no good. You're doing so well, right? You're almost done. Let me try to talk to her and see what's going on. And so the student said, well, I've decided to divorce my husband. And the faculty was like, well, that's not really a learning outcome of the course. so they talked some more, and the faculty discovered that the student came back to school not because she wanted or needed the knowledge or the credentials, right? She wanted to see what it's like to live an independent life from her husband. And a year and a half later, she decided, oh, it's all good. I'm going to divorce my husband and live happily ever after. Right? And so she dropped out of school. She got out of school what she needed or wanted, right? And so the faculty relayed that story and said, well, for a long time, that person thought teaching is about helping students learn things, right? About what I already know as an instructor. But that experience taught or led the faculty to think that, oh, maybe it's really about the students and their development, right? Either it's conceptual or personal, right, and many multifaceted development of the student. Right, so obviously, our goal is not to have all our students divorce their spouses, right? But in this case, another example is this one, right? So in this case, this other's faculty said learning is, right? So teaching is about getting students to learn how to solve their own problems. They have to encounter the problems themselves and then solve them themselves, right? So teaching is really an enablement for students to encounter these problems and then learn to solve them. In this case, it's interesting, what the faculty is talking about is actually about PhD students and postdocs in this research group. So this is the kind of learning that we often describe for sort of graduate students and postdocs. Yeah.
Could you speak to your statement, teaching is a byproduct of learning, what that means?
So in the literature, so what this means is that, so in the other, actually I'm going to roll to the next one because that's a better comparison. Right, so in this case, it's really talking about the connection or the relationship between teaching and learning. In the first conception, right, teaching is often seen as separate as learning. Right, so the faculty who teaches to an empty room, right, it's his professional duty and he's done it, and whatever the learning and students happening is really none of his business. Right, in the middle one, teaching causes learning. So in this case, right, because the faculty holds all the knowledge and content and skills, right, I have to teach it so that the students can learn it. Right, in the last one, right, where learning is really sort of a two-way construction, like the faculty and students are working together in developing a new understanding. Like that new understanding may just be new for students, right? It might not be new for the faculty, but it's still sort of developing a new understanding for the students. And so in that case, right, the teaching doesn't necessarily cause the learning, right? The learning can happen just even among students, and then.
Oh, so you're assuming that teaching is something that the faculty does?
Yeah, so in this case, it's sort of, in literature, that's sort of specific.
So in this definition, then the faculty constructing experiences and environments for the students to learn would not be considered teaching then?
Well, it would be considered teaching, but it's not, it's a byproduct is a specific word in literature. It's basically saying that like teaching and learning can happen at the same time, and it's a two-way. Yeah, sorry.
I was going to throw in as an example, if I'm teaching and a student comes to my office and they present a piece of paper with a half-worked out problem on it, it's exactly where they've got to in the problem that causes me to make an act of teaching.
Right, yeah. So that's true. I haven't thought too much about the words because they have specific meaning in the literature, but okay, yeah. That's actually a good question and example. Right, so I'm actually going to give another analogy for these three things before we go on. One, so you know there's this fable about how you give a person a fish, you feed them for a day, right? That's sort of the transmission one, right? And then the acquisition one is when you teach a person how to fish, right? And you feed them for a lifetime, I guess. That's what that is. And the development one is we basically teach students so that they can invent fishing when the time is right, and then they can feed humanity forever, basically. And so those are sort of the three different kinds of things that's going on, right? So in our case study, right, Adam has a transmission conception. In this case, he says, I provide students all the basic information, and then they have to learn on their own for the exam, right? So the teaching and learning are not connected. Philip creates an environment where students have the opportunity to learn, right? And then the goal of this learning environment is to help them understand the facts and materials, right? Getting the idea and the concepts that's already known in the field. Right, and so we think that actually explains what's happening, right? So because Adam has this transmission conception, right, he actually said what students need to do is get together in these groups and then they do this thing. And later on in the interview, Adam actually told us this is a phenomenal way of transmitting the information to students because I give them the worksheet and then I'm finished. Instead of giving a 50-minute lecture, the act, like it takes 5 minutes to give out the handouts and then they do their own thing and I can check my email at the podium and various sorts of things like that. Right? And so this is very consistent, right, with the transmission conception, even though Adam has changed the approach of how he transmits the information. Right? So even though it looks like he's doing a lot of interactive things, right, he's still sort of thinking, sort of retrofitted the idea of active learning in that transmission conception. Right? Whereas Philip is the one who talked about the forest. So he's the one who's like guiding students through the forest, right? So he spends a lot of time moving around and talking to them. And the goal of guiding them through the forest is that they can walk through the same forest, right, again. So it's sort of a metaphor for learning the material and concepts and skills in the field that's already known, right? So this is acquisition, but not really developing new ideas. Right, and so what we think here is, this is the existing model in the literature, right? So the linear model where what you believe in informs what you plan to do, and what you plan to do informs what you actually do. Based on our data, what we actually think is that the approach explicitly informs your practice, right? If you decide to use clicker questions, or if you decide to use group activities, you're going to use them, right? But then the conception actually implicitly informs how you implement those approaches. Right, so we see in the case of Adam and Philip, both of them explicitly decided to do group activities, but the way that it's done is inconsistent with their conception. Right? We don't have explicit data for that, but we think when you try new things, it might change, what you think, and then there's sort of connections throughout all three things. So I'm going to finish up with the second story very quickly. This is 3 instructors. In this case, it's Adam, James, and Luke. We're going to include Philip just as an additional comparison point. But basically, we're going to look at how Adam and James do clicker questions, and then how Adam and Luke do activities. Right, so here's Adam, James is Charles. I got the wrong, sorry. We changed the name sometimes, sorry. I was like, James sounded weird, but I'm just, okay. Charles, sorry. Okay. Sorry, yes, Charles. Yes, that's correct. There's a way how we name the pseudonym, so I'm trying to work through the algorithm. Yes, Charles is correct. But anyway, yeah, this person in pink here. Anyway, so right by the Copus observation, right, they do a lot of talking. Charles is interesting because he doesn't pose a lot of questions. He doesn't spend a lot of time, spends about the same amount of time answering questions as Adam, but what he does is give a lot more follow-up information, right? So it's maybe a little bit different. And so what we found is that Charles has an acquisition conception of teaching, and the way that was not obvious in the Copus observation is how they implement it, right? So there's an explicit structure to Charles' clicker questions is in the sort of Eric Mazur purely instruction way, right? You do it first on your own, you click in, I then decide based on what you've done whether to have a group conversation, right? And how to move forward, and helping students engage and learn the material. The prompt is very different, right? So one is focused on just sort of task completion, and the other is focused on the rationale and reason behind what you're thinking. And then, pacing is by the instructor. So Adam said, here's a clicker question, please answer it. Okay, we're done, let me tell you what the answer is. Right? Whereas Charles does it by students, so he waits until about 70% of the students have clicked in, and he said, okay, looks like most of you are finished. I'm going to close the poll in 30 seconds, so please, the remainder of you, please click in. Right, so that often translates into really different wait time, and also the total time for each question is also very different. Right, so even though both people are using clicker questions in their lectures, right, they're using them in very different ways. And then for group, this is very, very interesting. Luke here is sort of our third comparison point with Philip. He spends quite a bit of time waiting. He doesn't move around in group a lot, so he looks quite like Adam, right, in some sense. But he does a lot of follow-up information, he does a lot of lecturing, and also does a lot of posing questions, right? I'm going to just tell you what this is. So it turns out that Luke has a development conception, but it's absolutely unclear from the Copus data, right? And so what we did was we reconstructed the lesson plan from the videos. And what we found is that the way Adam does it is, okay, here's an activity on whatever this topic is, do this activity, right? And then they do the activity. So often the students just do the activity and then they leave, right? Sometimes Adam gives a summary conclusion that says, okay, this is what you're supposed to have learned, right? Luke introduces not the activity, but an observation. So in this case, an example is there's this really famous video of a macrophage, an immune cell, chasing a bacteria, right? And it's totally magical. It's unclear how the immune cell knows where the bacteria is moving, right? And so the cell's sort of chasing after it, right? So then Luke says, okay, this is really interesting, and this is related to what we've learned, right? Something. So it takes a long time to set this up, right? And then he has an activity that involves students in analyzing some data, and he says, okay, based on these data, what I'd like you to do is come up with a model or explanation for how this sort of chasing works, right? How the immune cells know where the bacteria is, right? And the activity is short. It's 20 minutes or so. And then what Luke does is he walks around and takes pictures of a few models, right? And then he brings them all up and say, okay, here are 4 different models. I give you a little bit of explanation of each, and now that you've seen different models, which one would you vote to be the best explanation for what's happening based on the data? right? And then he goes through iterations of this. He says, okay, now what if I give you this extra piece of data, right? Can you vote again and which one is the most consistent, or which model doesn't work, right? So it's this sort of synthesis and construction from student work together, right? They construct an understanding and meaning for what's happening. Right, so Luke's the one that said fundamentally teaching is changing someone's understanding, right, of the world by making it deeper and more in line with the scholarship with what's rigorously true, yada, yada, yada. Actually, once he said the word true, he spent about 5 minutes telling us it's only true until it's not, which I learned in mathematics is not true. Once it's true, it's always true. But in biology, right, it's really only true until it is not. Right, because we can always come up with new information of what's going on. Right, so anyway, so it's really about students constructing their own understanding in this case. Right? So what we found from the 2 case studies is this sort of connection, explicit versus implicit connection, right? So the conception of teaching and learning is just really implicitly informing what people do. And so what we're thinking, sort of our current hypothesis or model is that, right, if we focus on the approach, right, it's sort of like a best practice, it's sort of like a technique or recipe, right? If I do this in this particular way, then it will always have that outcome, which is not always true, right? Whereas if we focus on the conception, is really getting people to reflect on their teaching as a science or methodology with underlying principles, right? And then so whatever they do, right, will be informed by a deeper understanding for how people learn and things like that, right? And so what we think is that the conception is really the key to effective implementation. And so that's potentially why we're seeing, right, the kind of persistent literature on how active learning doesn't quite work at large scale or in the wild. So I think that's all I have for you today. Happy to take more questions. I know we've had a lot of good conversations. Yeah.
So what role does skill and competence in implementing your approach, how do you think that fits in here? So for example, I have days when I manage group activities poorly, and I have days when I manage it well, and hopefully I have a lot more of these days, good days than not, and compared to 15 years ago.
Right.
Right. So there's hopefully a growth in my competence over time, despite perhaps my conception not changing and my approach not particularly changing. I don't know if you think that's a factor in all of this or not.
The skill, that's a good question. I'm not entirely sure where the skill fits in. It might be sort of both conception and approach, right? So you're, right, the fact that you're rethinking and improving or changing your strategy, right, means that you're not just treating the strategy as sort of a recipe. And I'm going to just do it and it will always work the same way, right? So you're probably sort of treating it as sort of with underlying ideas, even though you may not be explicitly thinking or going into the education literature saying, oh, this didn't work because of these demonstrated reasons or theoretical understanding. You're still sort of reflecting and thinking about why it didn't work and how do I change it. And so that's really thinking about the reflective practice and underlying ideas.
So is the goal of teaching to enable student, well, like maybe broadly, like we're enabling student so that they can reinvent fishing? Is that what the goal is then?
Well, maybe not reinvent, right? It's to invent.
What I'm really trying to ask is there like some basic things, there's some threshold that, you know, like depending on a class, that, you know, like it's not enabling, but like teaching what I know already so that they can like spend other class or their time enabling themselves?
Yeah, so there's a follow-up part of the study that I didn't end up making slides to talk about, is there's this interesting sort of new idea about conception of research and learning and how, whether those two are same or different. So some faculty consider research is different from student learning, and other faculty consider research is a form of learning, like a very high, sophisticated professional learning, and student learning is also learning, So those two things are actually the same, right? So the process is the same, even though, right, so for those faculty, the way they talk about it is that, well, I'm an expert, and so my boundary of knowledge, right, happens to be, you know, roughly the same as humanity's boundary of knowledge. And so when I learn things, I'm pushing the boundary of my personal knowledge and humanity's knowledge. For a student, right, their knowledge, their boundary of knowledge is still a boundary. And so when they learn things, they are sort of pushing that boundary. It just happens that most of the time that boundary is not the same as humanity's boundary, right? And so in that case, right, the learning is this, the process of learning is the same, right? And so it's really about deeply engaging with the material. And so that's sort of the most consistent, sort of, at least internally consistent with that development and conception of teaching.
I have a question about the two initial faculty, the one with the transmissionist conceptions. What was the motivation for him to even make a course that embedded active learning, if given this transmission? I don't know, do you have any insight into that? Because it didn't seem like he fully adopted it in the classroom.
Well, I think faculty are people who are highly accomplished and want to do well in whatever they do, right? So even if you have a transmission conception of teaching, you still want to teach better and transmit better. And so you're still going to look for ways to improve your craft, right? And so in that case, what we saw was sort of reinterpretation or retrofitting of these active learning ideas into that conception, right? And so his idea is, well, now I give them the activity and it's a better transmission because the literature tells me, right, that it's more effective than me talking to them, right? And so other people who have transmission conception, right, may try to improve their teaching by, you know, learning how to project and be more sort of engaging in a sort of theatrical way, right? So that's typically what happens. It's actually unusual for someone with a transmission conception to do these other things, but in this case what we saw is that he took those ideas and sort of, right, incorporated into his understanding, that transmission understanding.
So in your conversations with faculty, how sort of context dependent are these conceptions? So what I'm imagining is if I'm teaching a very low level class to freshmen, I might have a more transmission point of view, but if you put me into a graduate class, I mean, has that come out in your interviews at all, or he seems to be a sort of static capacity?
So it's somewhat context dependent. The grain size is probably bigger, right? So the person who said it's about enablement, right? That's the person who's talking about his graduate students and postdocs in his research group. And then when he talked about undergraduates and it's an upper level undergraduate chemistry course, he said, right, that it's my job to give them that information. And so I think that split is often sort of between undergraduate and graduate education, because that graduate education is about the research, right? And then it's more consistent with that research learning idea than the sort of student content learning idea.
Do you have student data on
we don't have student data. Well, we have motivation and interest data on MOOC students, and it's no change, which again is a victory. But yeah, we don't have sort of concept data because it's a different course, and sort of no concept inventories available at the time. Yeah.
Do you have any opinions on the differences between acquisition and development approach in terms of impact on students' outcomes?
How impactful for student?
So the difference between acquisition and development conception, do you have any sense of how that's going to play out in terms of impact on student outcomes?
My guess is it depends on what the student outcomes are, right? So if the student outcomes are sort of acquisition of knowledge and skills in the discipline versus sort of a much longer term of engagement and deeper learning, right? I think those two are a little different. right? So I think, so one of my colleagues at UC Irvine extended my fish analogy was well, it's nice that we're trying to do this acquisition and developmental things, right? But at the end of the day, what we look at student outcomes is how many fish they have, and have they died from hunger because they have no fish to eat, right? But that is not consistent with the type of deeper creative learning that we're looking for in that development conception, right? So, right, because you know, what we're counting, if we're just counting how much we learn, if we're staying in the discipline, then that's mostly just consistent with the transmission or acquisition part. I know that doesn't quite answer your question because I don't quite know how to capture the types of outcome that are supposed to happen in that developmental setting. I think that's going to be a challenge. I know time-wise we have to.
Okay, well, we can thank Stanley for Thanks for having me here. This is